For much of the modern era, the United States occupied a unique position in global politics, not simply as a powerful country, but as a reference point. After the Second World War, American power shaped institutions, alliances, trade routes, and security frameworks that extended far beyond its borders. In many regions, stability became associated, directly or indirectly, with American involvement. This did not mean universal approval, but it did mean acceptance. For decades, the global system operated with the assumption that the United States would play a central role, setting rules, enforcing norms, and absorbing the costs of leadership. Over time, this assumption became so familiar that it felt permanent. But permanence in international politics is often an illusion. Part 2. How the post-Cold War system took shape. With the end of the Cold War, American power entered a new phase. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed the primary structural counterweight that had defined global politics for nearly half a century. What followed was not a moment of chaos, but a period of consolidation. Institutions created during earlier decades expanded their reach. Economic globalization accelerated under frameworks strongly influenced by Western norms. Security arrangements adapted to a world without a single clear rival. In this environment, American decisions carried disproportionate weight, not because they were always uncontested, but because alternatives were limited. This created a system that functioned efficiently, but unevenly. Part 3. When friction started to appear. At first, the signs of resistance were subtle. They did not announce themselves through dramatic confrontations or sudden ruptures. Instead, they appeared as hesitation, recalibration, and quiet pushback. Allies began questioning decisions they once accepted without debate. Neutral countries explored alternative partnerships. Rival states tested boundaries more openly, often in specific regions rather than across the entire system. None of this happened overnight. But taken together, these signals pointed to a shift in how American power was perceived and how it was received. Part 4. Why acceptance turned into discomfort. As the global system became more interconnected, the consequences of American decisions traveled further and faster. Sanctions imposed in Washington affected markets across continents. Military actions taken in one region altered political calculations in others. Diplomatic positions hardened not only among adversaries, but among partners. What once felt distant now felt immediate. This interconnectedness amplified consequences. Actions that previously seemed contained began producing ripple effects far beyond their original context. And as these ripple effects accumulated, tolerance began to erode. Acceptance did not disappear, but it became conditional. And conditional acceptance marks the beginning of resistance. Part 5. When American decisions began to travel further. As the global system became more interconnected, the reach of American decisions expanded dramatically. Policies adopted in Washington no longer affected only immediate partners or rivals. They rippled outward, shaping markets, alliances, and political calculations far from their original point of origin. Economic measures illustrate this shift clearly. Sanctions, once targeted and limited in scope, became broader and more complex. Financial restrictions affected banks, shipping routes, insurance markets, and supply chains that spanned continents. For countries not directly involved in political disputes with the United States, these effects were often indirect, but no less real. Companies faced compliance risks. Governments adjusted trade relationships. Entire sectors recalibrated to avoid exposure. Over time, this created a sense that American policy choices were not merely influential, but unavoidable. This perception altered how power was experienced. Influence that once felt stabilizing began to feel intrusive. Rules that once appeared neutral began to feel selective. Even governments aligned with the United States started questioning how much autonomy they retained when global systems were so tightly connected to American decisions. The issue was not hostility, it was dependence. And dependence, in international politics, rarely feels comfortable. Part 6. When allies began to reassess their position. Among America's traditional allies, the shift was gradual but noticeable. Public disagreements became more frequent. Private consultations grew longer and more cautious. Joint statements softened in tone. In Europe, conversations about strategic autonomy gained momentum. These discussions did not imply a rejection of transatlantic cooperation. They reflected a desire for flexibility. European leaders began asking whether long-term reliance on American leadership limited their ability to respond independently to global challenges. Similar reassessments occurred elsewhere. In parts of Asia, governments balanced security cooperation with the United States against deepening economic ties with other major powers. In the Middle East, long-standing assumptions about American guarantees were reconsidered amid changing regional dynamics. None of this represented a clean break, but it did signal recalibration. This recalibration was shaped by experience. Repeated exposure to sudden policy shifts, sanctions imposed, agreements withdrawn, commitments redefined, reinforced the perception that alignment carried risk. Even when objectives overlapped, methods differed. As a result, allies increasingly sought to diversify their options rather than deepen dependence. This behavior was not confrontational. It was precautionary. Part 7. How institutions reflected the shift. International institutions often serve as mirrors of underlying power dynamics. As perceptions of American leadership changed, these institutions reflected that change. Consensus became harder to achieve. Voting blocs fragmented. Parallel forums gained relevance. In organizations once dominated by Western influence, alternative coalitions formed around specific issues. Rather than challenging the system directly, many countries worked within its rules while quietly adjusting outcomes. This approach allowed them to limit exposure without provoking open confrontation. At the same time, new institutions and arrangements emerged. Some focused on finance, others on infrastructure, others on regional cooperation. These initiatives did not replace existing structures overnight. They coexisted with them, but their presence reduced the centrality of any single power. Over time, this institutional diversification diluted American leverage. Not dramatically, but persistently. Influence became shared rather than concentrated. Authority became negotiated rather than assumed. This shift did not eliminate American leadership. It changed the conditions under which that leadership operated. Part 8. When pushback took concrete form. Over time, resistance to American power moved beyond rhetoric and recalibration. It began to take concrete form, not as a single coordinated response, but as a series of overlapping actions that shared a common logic: reduce exposure, limit dependence, preserve room to maneuver. One of the clearest examples appeared in economic behavior. Countries increasingly sought alternatives to systems where American influence was dominant. Trade agreements diversified, payment mechanisms evolved, bilateral arrangements multiplied. These efforts were rarely framed as opposition to the United States. Instead, they were described as risk management. But risk management, when practiced collectively, reshapes the system. Energy markets offered another illustration. For decades, energy flows were tightly linked to political alignments. Disruptions were often localized. As sanctions and export controls became more frequent tools of policy, producers and consumers adjusted. Long-term contracts shifted. New supply routes were prioritized. Investment decisions factored in political exposure alongside economic cost. Energy became not only a commodity, but a strategic buffer. This reduced the leverage of any single actor, including the United States. In the security realm, the shift was more delicate. Formal alliances remained intact. Joint exercises continued. Defense cooperation persisted. But beneath the surface, planning assumptions changed. Countries explored contingency scenarios that did not rely exclusively on American intervention. Regional capabilities were strengthened. Multilateral arrangements expanded beyond traditional alliance structures. These steps did not signal abandonment. They signaled hedging. Part 9. How rivals learned to work around American power. While allies recalibrated cautiously, rival powers adapted strategically. Rather than confronting the United States head-on, they focused on indirect methods. They identified areas where American influence was strong and areas where it was thinner. Then they acted accordingly. In some regions, they invested heavily in infrastructure and development, creating long-term dependencies that did not rely on military presence. In others, they emphasized diplomatic engagement, presenting themselves as predictable partners in contrast to perceived volatility elsewhere. This strategy did not require matching American power. It required patience. Crucially, these rivals avoided framing their actions as anti-American. Instead, they emphasized sovereignty, non-interference, and mutual benefit. This language resonated with countries wary of external pressure. Over time, it normalized alternatives. Not alternatives to the global system as a whole, but alternatives within it. Technology further accelerated this process. Digital infrastructure, communications networks, and data governance became new arenas of influence. Control over standards mattered as much as control over territory. As technological ecosystems diverged, so did political alignment. Countries made choices not only about security and trade, but about compatibility. Once again, the result was fragmentation rather than confrontation. Part 10. When resistance became a pattern, not an exception. What distinguishes the current moment is not any single action or decision. It is repetition. Pushback against American power appears across regions, sectors, and institutions. Economic diversification, security hedging, institutional plurality, technological separation. Each response is modest on its own. Together, they form a pattern. This pattern does not suggest collapse. The United States remains a central actor in global affairs. Its influence is still vast. Its capabilities remain unmatched in many domains. But influence now operates in a more crowded environment. Leadership requires negotiation rather than assumption. Authority requires consensus rather than compliance. Importantly, resistance does not always come from hostility. Often it comes from familiarity. Countries that have worked closely with American power understand its strengths and its limits. They know when alignment benefits them and when it constrains them. As global challenges multiply, flexibility becomes valuable, and flexibility requires options. The result is a world that looks less unified, but more adaptive. Power is not disappearing, it is being redistributed. This redistribution is uneven, slow, and incomplete, but it is real. By this stage, the question is no longer whether pushback exists. It clearly does. The question is what this shift means for the future of global leadership and how the United States responds to a world that no longer absorbs its power in the same way. Part 11. When leadership became harder to sustain. Leadership in international politics is rarely about control. It is about consent. For decades, American leadership benefited from a broad alignment of interests. Even when disagreements existed, the underlying structure remained intact. That structure absorbed friction. But as global conditions changed, sustaining leadership became more complex. Costs increased, expectations multiplied, and tolerance for unilateral action declined. Leadership now required constant negotiation, not only with rivals, but with partners. This shift altered the balance between influence and restraint. Decisions that once reinforced authority now carried reputational risk. Actions taken for strategic reasons produced diplomatic consequences elsewhere. In a system where information travels instantly, perception matters as much as capability. And perception is shaped not only by what a country does, but by how consistently it does it. The challenge was not loss of power, it was loss of margin. The margin that allowed mistakes to be absorbed, the margin that allowed leadership to be exercised without immediate resistance. As that margin narrowed, pushback became more visible. Part 12. How the future may take shape. The redistribution of influence does not follow a single trajectory. There is no fixed endpoint. Instead, multiple paths remain possible. In one scenario, cooperation adapts, institutions reform, expectations realign. Leadership becomes more distributed, but still coordinated. In this world, American power remains central, not because it dominates, but because it convenes. In another scenario, fragmentation deepens. Parallel systems expand, standards diverge, coordination weakens. Here, influence becomes regional rather than global. Power is exercised in narrower spaces with fewer shared rules. Between these extremes lies a more likely outcome, a world of selective alignment. Countries cooperate where interests overlap and hedge where they do not. Leadership becomes situational. Coalitions become issue-specific. This environment rewards flexibility more than dominance. For the United States, this means adaptation. Not abandonment of leadership, but recalibration of how leadership is exercised. The tools that once produced alignment may now produce resistance, and recognizing that shift is essential. Part 13. What pushback really signals. Pushback against power is often misunderstood. It is not always rejection. More often it is feedback, a signal that the system has changed faster than the habits of leadership. In this sense, resistance reflects engagement rather than disengagement. Countries push back because they are still inside the system. They care about outcomes. They care about rules. They care about exposure. The question, then, is not whether American power still matters. It clearly does. The question is how that power is exercised in a world that no longer responds automatically. A world where authority must be earned repeatedly, not inherited indefinitely. History rarely moves in straight lines. Periods of dominance give way to periods of adjustment. Stability gives way to recalibration. What matters is not preserving the past, but understanding the forces reshaping the present. Pushback is not the end of influence. It is the moment influence is tested, and how that test is answered will shape the next phase of global leadership.